Now we're back again with another video on the book of Esther. We have spoken about how that Esther and Mordecai had written a decree to all the Jews throughout all of the kingdom, the 127 provinces of King Ahasuerus, and they went all the way from India all the way around to Africa. And so the Jews had the right to protect themselves. So on the 13th day of the month of Adar, they protected themselves. They went out, they killed 75,000 people throughout the entire kingdom. And in the town of Shushan, which was the capital of Ahasuerus, he was the king. It was the capital of the king. They had killed 800 people there. And it says in the Hebrew that the Jews had gained relief. So it was kind of like, at least that part's over with. Okay, and in the city of Shushan, they gained some relief on the 14th, but on the 13th, but on the 14th, they did it again. They had killed a total of 800 people just right there in that town. And on the 15th, they had relief from the Jews. So now we're beginning in verse 18 of chapter 9. The Jews in Shushan, however, had assembled on the 13th and the 14th, and then on the 15th they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. So this is the day that they were celebrating the relief from their enemies. Verse 19, that is why rural Jews, those living in villages, observe the 14th of the month of Adar as the day of joy and feasting, a day of giving presents to each other. Mordecai, remember, he's been elevated up throughout the kingdom now, and he's number 2 man in charge. Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to the Jews throughout the provinces of King Ahasuerus, near and far, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and the 15th days of the month of Adar, so the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies. So now he's making a command, telling them throughout this entire realm, this is what's going to happen. Notice this is very important. They're to celebrate annually on the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar. When the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned to joy. Okay. And their mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy, giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. Okay. So the Jews agreed to continue the celebration. They had begun doing what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast the pur, that is, cast the lot, for their ruin and destruction. But when the plot came to the king's attention, he issued written orders that the evil scheme of Haman had devised against the Jews should come back upon his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore, these days were called Purim, from the word pur, that is, to cast the lot. Because of everything written in this letter, and because of what they had seen and what had happened to them, the Jews took it upon themselves to establish the custom that they and their descendants and all who joined them should without fail observe these 2 days every year in the way prescribed and at the appointed time. These days should be remembered and observed in every generation by every family and every province and every city. And these days of Purim should never cease to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should the memory of them die out among their descendants. So Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, now this is the first time we find out anything about her family. Her daddy is Abihail, along with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority confirming this second letter concerning Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews in the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, words of goodwill and assurance, to establish these days of Purim at their designated time, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had decreed to them, and as they had established for themselves and their descendants in regard to their times of fasting and lamentation. Esther's decree confirmed these regulations about Purim, and it was written down in the records. And so we come to almost the end of the book of Esther now, and we found out that even though maybe some of the Jews didn't like Mordecai, because it was on the account of Mordecai that they got in trouble in the first place, he would not bow down to Haman. If you remember, Haman would come to the king's gate, everybody else would bow down, Mordecai just sit there or stand there. He wouldn't bow. This caused tremendous turmoil within the 127 provinces. This is why the first edict was written in the first place, is because of Mordecai. Yeah, just think about that for a moment. Okay, now, so when it's all over with and they get relief from their enemies, now Mordecai, second in command of the kingdom, is going to establish for all Jews a holiday. Excuse me, a holiday called Purim. And this holiday, there's going to be rejoicing, there's going to be celebrations, they're going to give each other gifts, they're going to give money to the poor. You do all of this on Purim to remember overcoming this decree. Not only do you remember, but you also teach your children and generations to come. So now Mordecai is making a feast for the Jews to continue. Well, that's not unusual, really. We have the major feasts in the Bible. They're the feast of the Lord. Now, a lot of people call them the feast of the Jews, but they're not. It specifically says the feasts of the Lord, and they are Passover, Pentecost, and Feast of Tabernacles. Those are the three main ones. But there are 4 smaller feasts that were created by prophets, and I'll just go through those for just very shortly here. Most of you have never heard of any of these. I'll give you a little bit of reference to them. The first one is the feast or the fast day on the 10th of Tevet. That's the month of Tevet. It is the mourning, M-O-U-R-N, mourning, crying, because of the siege of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. It ended several months later with the destruction of the temple. This is found in 2 Kings, the destruction of the temple. The first reference that we have to this 10th day of Tevet is Zechariah 8:19. It is called the Feast of the 10th month. Then we have another reference, a couple of more in Ezekiel chapter 33 and verse 21 and chapter 21 verses 1 through 24. Also, Jeremiah references this feast in chapter 52. Chapter 52, verses 4 through 6. Now, that's the first feast that was not considered one of the feasts of the Lord, but it's a feast nevertheless. The second one is 18 months later, there was after the 10th day of Tevet, the walls of Jerusalem were breached. Great big ramrod that broke holes through the walls on the 17th day of Tammuz. Now that's another month. And then exactly 3 weeks later, after they broke through the walls, Solomon's temple was destroyed. Now, maybe you've heard of this one. This is the 9th of Av. That is the actual day after they broke through the walls. It's 3 weeks after they broke through the walls. They began to destroy the temple, and they started carrying. That's the first time that they started carrying people off to Babylon. There were 3 different times that they carried people off to Babylon. Okay, and of course Daniel and Ezekiel and were part of that. Then we have another time that has turned into a feast, and it's called the Feast of Gedalia. It is in 2 Kings 25, verses 25 and 26, and in Jeremiah chapter 41, verse 1. It's also referenced in Josephus and in Zechariah chapter 8, verse 19. So these 4 feasts are now added on top of these that have been added by prophets. Mordecai is adding another feast here. It is the Feast of Purim. Okay, and so this is going to be incumbent upon not just the people, but on all generations yet to come, to remember this time that the people were saved by a series of happenings that you really have to look hard to find God in it. Now, we looking back at it, we say, oh, it's got to be God because it couldn't have happened any other way. Remember, the book of Esther is the only book that does not have a reference to God in it.